Hello, and thank you to Oklu for having me today as their speaker. My name is Natasha Randall, and I have prepared a short talk today about my biographical research into the figure of the literary translator Constance Garnett. Specifically, recently I've been focusing on one question: what biographical material can be found in a person's written work? Translators notionally produce non-original text, but are there aspects of their work, their semantic tendencies perhaps, word choice, audible effects, that can expose something of their personal nature or their lived experience? Garnett brought roughly 70 volumes of Russian literature to English readers over the course of her lifetime, often first translations. And yet her existing letters and diaries amount to so few words in comparison. Can her translations provide additional insight into her life and character? What are the detectable choices in Garnett's work that can contribute to a portrait of her? I had originally intended with this talk, arranged last year, to speak about Garnett's life, her diaries and her letters. But I've been thwarted by the pandemic, which presents me with the problem that I can't get to Northwestern University's library to access the bulk of her archive. And I can't really see when that next might happen. So, like a cook with just the ingredients of the kitchen cupboard, I'm making use of what is at hand, the translations themselves. It has been an interesting excavation. Can translations be viable as primary source material? As pieces of writing that involve choices, aesthetic and moral, do they contain usable features for the purpose of writing a life? But first, a little bit about Constance Garnett, derived from encyclopedias and Garnett family histories. Constance Garnett was born in 1892 in Brighton, one of 8 children, born to Clara Maria Patton and David Black. Her father became an invalid when she was young, and her mother died of injuries received in caring for her father. Despite a childhood of illness herself, she was given an education and won a scholarship to read classics at Newnham College, Cambridge, where she excelled. Afterwards, she worked as a librarian at the People's Palace Library in the East End of London. For context, this was 1888, the very year that Jack the Ripper was terrorising the same Whitechapel streets where she lived and worked. She had met Edward Garnett, who was younger than her, and they had become lovers, until they were married in 1889. Meanwhile, Edward Garnett had strong family ties to the reading room at the British Museum, a haven for exiles, many from Russia. It was through her husband's family that Constance Garnett met many Russian émigrés, including Felix Volhovsky and Sergius Stepniak, who were so influential in piquing her interest in the language and literature of Russia. She was captivated by their stories of revolution and literary experiment. With their help, she began to learn Russian in 1891 when she was pregnant with her only child, David. She first tried translating some smaller stories by Tolstoy and Goncharov, and soon turned to Turgenev, an author that she would be particularly attuned to over the course of her career. She travelled to Russia in 1894 for 3 months, where she met Tolstoy and at last gained first-hand experience of the culture. Upon her return, she launched into a decades-long pursuit of literary translation. She was assiduous and prolific, and by all accounts very disciplined, even as her health failed and her eyesight deteriorated towards her death in 1946. That's a short version of her life, and if you look at mentions of Constance Garnett in literary histories or the biographies of others, you will find an oft-repeated image. A lady in a high-collared dress, her hair in a loose bun, bespectacled and unsmiling. Indeed, history has not treated her altogether kindly. To be sure, it's easy to find mistakes in 70 volumes of work. And her reputation was not immune to a certain measure of misogyny. Nabokov said of her translations that they were dry and flat and always unbearably demure. But he also said that the ideal translator should be male, so we are taking his comments with a grain of salt. Others suggest that her work had a different kind of consistency that was troubling. Joseph Brodsky said, "The reason English-speaking readers can barely tell the difference between Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky is that they aren't reading the prose of either one. They're reading Constance Garnett." Edward Crankshaw put it differently. After reading a passage from Turgenev's story, The Tryst, he writes, Whether in the Russian of Turgenev or the English of Constance Garnett, you have to throw up your hands in acknowledgement of magic. There is no knowing how it is done. The translation is no less than the original. And if that is not genius, then I don't know what is. Joseph Conrad contributed here too with similar. He said, Turgenev for me is Constance Garnett, and Constance Garnett is Turgenev. And though these comments may be veiled slights or perhaps confounded compliments, they are relevant to this project. Can Garnett's words be so of herself that she can viably translate a pantheon of Russian greats, and yet still have a style of her own, a vernacular, a specific way with language? Is her language always unbearably demure? Or a safe, bland script, as Tchaikovsky said? Perhaps genius, as Edward Crankshaw described it? Or is it a marvel of achievement, as Catherine Mansfield had it? Garnett herself describes a moment in a radio interview, published in The Listener in 1947 after her death, that characterizes this very same consistency. She said, "Once when I was translating a sportsman's sketches, I gave the first draft of 6 of the stories to the Russian revolutionary leader Stepniak to read over. I had put, as I always did, alternative words above the line wherever I was in some doubt about the right word. Well, when I had finished all the stories in the volume, I asked Stepniak for my manuscript, but he declared he had given it back to me. However, I could not remember his doing so, and it was nowhere to be found. So I translated the 6 stories again. When I had done this, Stepniak found my first translation among his papers and returned it. So I compared the 2 translations to choose the best passages from each. To my surprise, I found they were identical. I had hesitated in the same places, over the same words, and had written the same possible alternatives above the line in the same places. I concluded that though someone else might do a better version, it was clear that I could not myself. I had done the only version that I was capable of. As a translator, I understand this too well. Once you've spent long enough time with a text, you tend to pull together an algorithm through which you will filter that text. It's acquired cumulatively. It requires a multitude of rereadings, a suffusion in the language. But once it is set, you tend to apply it regularly, perhaps like finding out the musical key in which a sonata is written, when you know the accidentals, the ornaments, and indeed the keyed signature. You are able to navigate the music with some confidence. But it is always an interpretation. There is no objectivity to something as living and fluid and various over time and geography as language. A few words on the transfer of Russian words to English words. There is a terrific chasm between the Russian and English languages. Word equivalence, of which Nabokov was so fond in his own translations, is a dangerous proposition. Let me briefly explain. Compared to English words, Russian words move so much. They literally concatenate. Suffixes and prefixes are liberally applied. It makes for a very flexible language, something that we don't have in English with its admixture of Anglo-Saxon and Latinate elements. Our words move less internally. It's often the prefixes that give Russian words motion. They start something moving before the verb starts it happening. I'll give you an example. The verb pradat means to sell, but if you break it down to pro and dat, you have the bartering motions of the meaning in its form. So it means to through give, prodat, to through give. So you're giving something through another mechanism. This is what selling is the word for selling in Russian. Another example is razесть, which means to corrode. Corrode, a sort of solid word. But razесть means to around eat, which has a much more physical, kinetic force to it. The word umyślenie, so important to Dostoyevsky, has such a rushing heave-ho to it in Russian. It comes into English, if you're breaking it down, as upthinking or at-thinking. It doesn't translate into what the dictionary gives as sort of premeditated or deliberate. It's got more movement in it somehow, this upthinking. Does that show how the languages just don't quite match? Can you see how the music's are slightly different? In carrying the text across the language barrier, you must acquire it and deliver it anew. The behaviour of translation is idiomatic. So take the purportedly demure Constance Garnett and the most bombastic of the great Russian writers, Nikolai Gogol. A couple of years ago, I worked on her translations of Gogol's short stories for a new edition by Riverrun in the UK. They asked me to edit her translations, but not in the normal way. They said, do not adjust her text to modernize it. Do not apply your aesthetic preferences, but do look to see where she faltered, where she may have omitted something, where she possibly shied away from a bold translation. Her mottled reputation preceded her, you see. So I took the project. Consider the challenges of translating Gogol, he who is poised at the fulcrum of early realism and the absurd. He writes that fish run around, while flies, wasps, and bees gang together. In his stories, grasshoppers scream, and fragrant grasses thrust themselves at you through carriage doors, flicking you pleasantly on the hands and face. These details form charged landscapes, sometimes to arouse in us contempt, sometimes sympathy. Gogol delivers to us the oppressed and the abused, and he mocks the vulgar manifestations of the middle classes. His tales are inflected with shame and soaked in the deeds of the devil and other unclean spirits. I found again that critics of Garnett had been hasty and myopic in their appreciation of her translations. With Gogol, Garnett was particularly attentive to idiom. She was an Edwardian lady striving for a slightly earlier English. She wrote, "It would show grotesque insensibility to produce a translation of Gogol written at the same time as Pickwick in the language of today's newspapers. I am particularly proud of having translated Dead Souls into English of the period in which it was written." This is not to say that her language in Gogol was necessarily Dickensian, usually not, but there is one instance of translation in this collection that illustrates this beautifully. It's both Pickwickian but utterly Gogolian. She translates the word yabedniki, which is a word to describe official persons, as pettifogging attorneys. Such renderings are excellent strokes of language, of which I found so many in the pages of her Gogol stories. We would do well to appreciate that Gogol's language is littered with dialect that is virtually untranslatable into English. Gogol himself was irked by the Ukrainian turns of phrase that were replaced in his Russian publications. He wrote, "There is a chasm of such phrases and expressions which we, the Little Russians, think will be understandable for Russians if we translate them word for word, but which sometimes destroy half of the meaning of the original. Remember that your translation for the Russians loses all the Little Russian revolutions and constructions." A Place Bewitched, the title story of the collection, contains both the Russian and Ukrainian words for watermelon, and Garnett, now stuck between three languages, is forced to give them the same word in English. Likewise, many of the characters speak ungrammatically. How could she render that without seeming to have made her own mistakes? The translator, no matter her time, cannot easily be ungrammatical. And dialects almost never travel well. Meanwhile, I looked for the prudish restraint of which she was so often accused, and in over 300 pages I found a rare instance that was truly Gogolian in its canine contortions. An old man is shouting at his friends that they should dance with him, and he calls them sabachi dzieci, which literally means the children of dogs. Garnett has it as puppies, which is possibly demure. But other translators have it as sons of bitches, which is excessively vitriolic. As an example of the adjustments I made to this new edition of Gogol Stories, I changed the phrase to read sons of dogs to capture the pejorative moderation of the expression. But I found Garnett's translation to be no more prudish than that of Gogol and his 19th century censors. I made other adjustments here and there, sometimes to include small dropped fragments and occasionally to correct a misappropriated gesture. Garnett, like Gogol, is sometimes prone to displacement. At one point in the carriage, Garnett simply drops a particularly confusing sentence, a description of a soldier who was lathering the village oath. The confusion is understandable. First, the term Gogol uses to pinpoint the location of this altercation describes the place of public punishment in a village square, for which I eventually found the word Ravenstone in English. And further, the lathering is given in confusing imagery, coming soon after a reference to moustaches, but which I realised in editing this text ought to convey that the officer was delivering blows to the man. The story, A Place Bewitched, has another such moment. Garnett and most subsequent translators of the same work have written that the old man of the story, when he danced upon his pumpkin patch, was stopped halfway through his dance, frozen by invisible forces. But in fact, the correct translation should tell us that the old man is stopped in his tracks halfway across the pumpkin patch, in the patch, not in the dance. It's a sort of Gogolian mishap of translation, which matters only because the story describes a bewitched place and not a bewitched dance. But these moments were rare, and witnessing the balletic linguistics of Garnett's translation at close quarters was awe-inspiring, for she is a meticulous chaperone to Gogol's bewitched places. The work I did with Garnett's Gogol collection was immense. The publisher seemed to think it was a lighter task than the usual work of literary translation, but it was almost as intense. And certainly it felt like a collaboration. I felt that I had come to know her somehow over the course of editing her words. But how was that? What were we doing, she and I, that felt that I had acquired a sense of her? Translators adore conjuring analogies for the process of translation. Bridging, ushering, taxidermy. I once wrote to the poet Arkady Dragomachenko. Our correspondence was published in an American literary magazine called A Public Space, and we were discussing translation and extra-textual space. I arrived at the metaphor of memorial. As a translator, I think I am sometimes leading words into an afterlife. Translation being one great act of memorializing. And when you're setting up your word monuments to an original unit, you are always making it forgotten, forgetting it by memorializing it. That duality is captured in the Russian word for forgetting, zabыть. When you crack that word down the middle, you have za and быть, which give you beyond being, across being, other side being, exchange for being, on behalf being. All good ways to describe the act of translation. To forget, to translate. As you can see, I have trouble as someone with a deep knowledge of languages in seeing languages as equivalent. Continuing with the idea that translating is the process of forgetting and memorializing a text, I want to look at the active reality of the process, just to show you where it might be pertinent to the life-writing activity. I'm not sure you can ever describe the translator as people do, as an intermediary who must strive for invisibility. It's not possible. A translator is a reader and a writer, and between the reading of the original text and the writing of her rendering is the forgetting. You can't read directly into another language. You read and contribute your own personal idiom, your memories, your biases, your associations to the text. And then the translator moves from reader to writer over and over again. She reads, she contributes to the text, she creates the text as a reader, as all readers do, and then she rewrites it. Saying a translation is wrong is like saying a reading is wrong. This is possible in an academic sense. There are arguments to be made on correct readings, but also crucially, without the reader, the text doesn't exist. It's the witnessing that occasions the text. Every translation is valid in this regard. So if translation is a rewriting, which is to say writing, then can it be a source of biographical research? You would never say that a novelist's oeuvre was irrelevant to their life story. But is it only in the themes and the characters of their work that this plays out? The translator does not produce the themes and characters of a work, though they can colour their output. I shall take a fragment to show you how translators variously colour a text. Here is a sentence from the beginning of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. This is a book that Constance Garnett translated, and I also translated in the Russian, for what it's worth. Мне теперь хочется рассказать вам, господа, желается или не желается вам это слышать, почему я даже и насекомым не сумел сделаться. Скажу вам торжественно, что я много раз хотел сделаться насекомым, но даже и этого не удостоился. Клянусь вам, господа, что слишком сознавать – это болезнь, настоящая, полная болезнь. Constance Garnett translates this as, I want now to tell you, gentlemen, whether you care to hear it or not, why I could not even become an insect. I tell you solemnly that I have many times tried to become an insect, but I was not equal even to that. I swear, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness. That's her. My translation, if you can capture the difference. I would like now to tell you, gentlemen, whether or not you wish to hear it, why I have never been able to become even an insect. I will tell you solemnly that I have often wanted to become an insect, but I have yet to earn even that honour. I swear to you, gentlemen, that being too conscious is a disease, a real and total disease. So, she used the word illness where I used the word disease. Others have used the word sickness. She says that he many times tried to become an insect, and I wrote that he often wanted to become an insect. Later, she uses the word equal to, and I use the term to have the honour of. Finally, I called the disease of consciousness total, where she had thoroughgoing. Other translators have had thorough and full-blown. Dostoyevsky's word is polnaya. Everyone whose translations I checked uses the word solemnly in the same place. Everyone has insect too. Everyone says conscious. These are all standard across the translations. Constance Garnett was the only one to add an M dash, which has a very different role in Russian, often replacing the verb to be. But she leaves it here. I've seen her do that before, leaving idiosyncratic punctuation in her English text. It strikes me as quite bold, quite a lot less smoothing than mine, or the Penguin Classics version by Ronald Wilkes, both of which convert to an expected English punctuation using a comma. But anyway, can you see how much character, how much choice is at play here? Is it the choice of words, or is it the music of the translation? I have to concede that this is idiom at work and not necessarily character. When I say idiom, I mean one's own particular way with language. Her way. There are clues as to Garnett's person in these words, but these clues aren't solid enough to draw conclusions. Illness, equal and thoroughgoing, as opposed to disease, honour and total. Is there a difference in flavour? Constance Garnett was so horrified later in her life by what she saw as the slipshod errors of her earlier translations. Do these errors reflect her character? It seems not. But do they reflect her story? Yes, somewhat, her circumstances. She taught herself Russian, relied on a series of friends for help in various measure, but also she was just sometimes in a rush to hand her work into the publishers. She needed to be paid. Also, often she would have been required to pay for any latter corrections to a publication and chosen not to. If she was restrained, sometimes it was in anticipation of a public reaction. Let us not forget that as the first translator of many of these works, she had a different and greater burden than those who have now stood upon her shoulders. Her version of Turgenev's A Nest of Gentlefolk. She called it a house of gentlefolk. And she explained why. She said she was afraid the public would think nest too queer. Someone else at the time published a version called A Nest of Hereditary Legislators. So you can see how competent her version could be in comparison. But why, when I was analysing Constance Garnett's Gogol, and indeed earlier in my career when I was looking at translator Mira Ginsberg's archive at the Columbia University collections, after I translated Zamyatin's We, why did I feel such an intimate connection with these other translators? In the case of Ginsberg, I could see her handwritten work, the corrections and the crossings out. I could see where she struggled, and I remember thinking, yes, that was a very difficult sentence. And yes, that word, what to do with that word? In the case of Constance Garnett, I only have access to her solutions at the moment, to the final draft of her translations. But I can see there what she did, how she wended her way around the thickets of language. But was I coming to know her? Really to know her? I came to the conclusion that what I was doing was reading. I was reading her translations, and it was my reading that was providing the intimacy. But it is somewhat imaginary. What I feel is intimacy with her, because I think I can see the choosing she is doing in any one instance. But that is applied by me in my reading. I was reminded of a review in the TLS of Ruth Sker's John Aubrey book that said, Sker emphasizes the fuzziness and partial nature of all biography, which emphasizes the ambiguity and unfinishedness of all life. Our actual lives are singular to ourselves. Our afterlives are necessarily plural. Do I know her? I feel I do. So what I had there was a biographical experience, but not something that's transferable for others necessarily. So the affinity I feel with her as I read her translations and see how she solved things isn't as a translator, it's as a reader, a privileged reader, one who has access to the original language. So we both read the Russian, and I get to see how she sees that. It's the witnessing of an interpretation. Virginia Woolf saw as the primary objective of biography to create an intimacy between the reader and the subject, forming something like a literary friendship. This is what I feel I have with Constance Garnett. It's perhaps what those biographers feel when they follow their subject on an epic journey across a desert or along a glacier. Perhaps we are just Sputniks. I can offer one other analogy, that old trope in which one attempts to equate the arts. If I hear Itzhak Perlman play Vivaldi, can I really tell you about his interpretation, about what I witnessed? I can tell you about some of the technical details, but does that capture what I witnessed? The intimacy of the event, the listening in real time? And if I also know how to play that Vivaldi piece, can I see more in his interpretation than others might? I can only describe my strange task of going through Garnett's translations, especially in a formal capacity with the Gogol, as a sort of collaboration, but not one that can be easily transmitted to others. Perhaps this is like Perlman's biographer will be, his future biographer, when faced with the task of describing his playing in words. All that seems available is the hybridized bibliomemoir form that I am now delivering to you. I think I can say that there are traces of a life lived in translated material, but it may be that it is only something that can be supportive of a more traditional history, or indeed through the processing of a memoir, an account by me of my experience of it. It would help to see the corrections she made to her manuscripts, some evidence of her own process. It will help to read the letters about her struggles with different passages and styles. It already helps to know that she experienced economic pressures which forced her to rush her work sometimes. I have tried to show you that there is a small but ineffable measure of character that comes through in word choice, but only as it washes over you during the course of many pages. Illness equal and thoroughgoing give us little with which to work. They are but tiny flailings in such microcosms. I have attempted a defense of her reputation, the very stuff of life writing, surely, against the criticism that her work was prudish and overly demure, and by extension that she was such a person. I feel that so far all I have achieved is a sort of disruption to the potted criticisms thrown around about her. I look forward to getting to her archive, where I might see more into her life. I have the sense that she is a much greater being than has previously been described. To me, she is resourceful and ingenious. She's clever, decisive, and sensitive. I see humour and play in her work. This is my reading of her work. I hope I have conveyed this to you in some measure. Thank you.